Good evening. I'm Nima, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, August 10th. We begin tonight in Newfoundland, where raging wildfires have led Environment Canada to issue special air quality warnings because of the smoke. It's expected to return tonight and continue tomorrow, posing an extra risk to children, seniors, and those with lung disease. The raging fires stranded communities in the south, stopping supplies of food and fuel from coming in. But this morning, the community of Milltown got some relief after a transport truck was able to cross a recently reopened highway and deliver groceries to the town of about 750 people. An Amber Alert for 2 Saskatchewan children has been canceled after they were found safe in South Dakota. Saskatchewan RCMP had said the children were believed to be traveling with a convicted sex offender as they extended the Amber Alert into the U.S. The county sheriff's office now says the suspect and children have been located by law enforcement. Police believe the young kids were with their mother and 50-year-old Benjamin Martin Moore, who was being investigated by social services when they left East End, Saskatchewan. Meanwhile, family members of an Indigenous woman who was found dead in a dump in Whitehorse 5 decades ago say they're still looking for answers. The RCMP has apologized for its failure to properly investigate the death of Tutsi Jimmy Charlie in 1967. Miss Jimmy Charlie's younger sister says her family has mixed emotions about the apology, and they hope it will lead to change at the National Police Force. The apology comes years after several members of Miss Jimmy Charlie's family publicly spoke about her death. This was during the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Canadians seeking compensation for flight delays, cancellations, and misplaced luggage will have to wait a little longer to get their money back. Tom Oomen of the Canadian Transportation Agency says they are dealing with an increasing backlog of air passenger complaints, and they're looking to hire more facilitators to handle them. Mr. Oomen says it takes less than a month on average to resolve a complaint once it reaches an agency facilitator. But a file now languishes for about a year before it lands on their desk. The backlog grew to over 15,000 in May and rose further in June. This as an uptick in travelers overwhelmed airline and airport resources following 2 years of muted demand due to the pandemic. Turning to Ontario now, where nursing unions were dealt some fresh wounds by the province's Conservative government yesterday. They wanted more from its throne speech, and they're criticizing what they say is a lack of a clear plan to tackle the current healthcare crisis. The Registered Nurses Association of Ontario says the government's response is out of step with the province's massive shortfall of nurses. This while the Ontario Nurses Association slammed the continued cap on nurses' wages. Premier Doug Ford says the government is working to address short-term stressors, all while noting long-term investments in integrated care, mental health, and addictions. All right, turning to a new poll that suggests the best leadership candidate, seemingly preferred by Conservatives, may face a tougher path to victory in a general election. The Leger poll found that 44% of Conservative voters surveyed think Mr. Poilievre would make the best party leader. This compared to Mr. Charest's 17% support. But among all Canadians polled, Mr. Charest had 22% support to Mr. Poilievre's 16%. The Conservative Party is expected to reveal its next leader on September 10th. On the West Coast, a veteran Indigenous fisherman says fishing on the Skeena River in BC has never been better, as he reports the biggest catches of sockeye salmon in decades. Pink salmon are also returning to British Columbia's rivers and streams by the thousands in areas where they were almost gone. Indigenous elders along the Central Coast say it's the first time in years they've seen local waters filled with jumping pinks. A strong run comes 2 years after the closure of open-net Atlantic salmon farms in the area. Lots of Canadian talent is expected to be showcased this year at the Toronto International Film Festival. An Indigenous romance and a documentary about the deadly downing of a Ukrainian airliner in Iran will be part of the homegrown talent to be seen. TIFF revealed the latest additions to its Canadian lineup today. Highlights include a film by Inuk throat singer Tanya Tagaq, which shows how the singer's improvisational performances connected to the land where she grew up in Nunavut. Anishinaabe filmmaker Darlene Naponce, who won TIFF's Air Canada Audience Choice Award in 2018, is vying for another hit at this year's festival with Stellar. Stay with us. After the break, we'll take a look at a link between climate change and worsening diseases. We're going to speak with Dr. Abhishek Raut about a recent study in Nature Climate Change, which finds a link to climate disasters and over half of the known infectious diseases that affect people. So stay tuned to Forum Daily. We'll be right back after a short break. A study in the journal Nature Climate Change finds climate disasters have worsened more than half of the hundreds of known infectious diseases that affect people. Disasters such as flooding, heat waves, and drought were found to impact diseases like malaria, hantavirus, cholera, and anthrax. Doctors dating back to Hippocrates have long connected disease to weather, but this study shows how widespread the influence of climate is on human health. Researchers also determined that 223 of the 286 human illnesses, including non-infectious conditions such as asthma, allergies, and even animal bites, seem to be worsened by climate hazards. Well, joining us now to tell us more about how climate can impact health is Dr. Abhishek Raut, Medical Director at Appletree Medical Group. Dr. Raut, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Pleasure to be here.
So, very interesting topic today. What would you say are the main takeaways from this study?
Well, I think the findings of this story are terrifying and illustrate the enormous consequences that climate change can happen on human pathogens. As you mentioned, we saw climate hazards such as flooding, heat waves, and drought worsen more than half of hundreds of known infectious diseases in people. But in addition to infectious diseases, they had looked at other non-infectious diseases, asthma, allergies, even animal bites, to see if there was any hazard or increase there. And as you mentioned, most of the illnesses were significantly worsened by climate hazards.
And these findings were quite surprising to me, Dr. Raut. We mentioned that many doctors already knew about the effects of climate disasters on health, but why is this still not widely known?
I think it's an established fact, especially in the medical community, that the burning of coal, oil, and natural gas can lead to these more frequent, intense, extreme weather. And there's been research that shows that the weather patterns have been associated with many health issues. The problem that a lot of people point out is correlation is not causation. So with studies like this, it's hard to really quantify the extent in which the hazards reviewed actually changed over the time period and the extent in which these changes attribute directly to those human changes.
All right, so let's talk about the direct impact that climate disasters have on diseases that are both non-infectious and infectious, Dr. Raut.
All right, great. So I think the most important thing we can take here is we can see that certain diseases like malaria are exacerbated in those cases there. The lead study author themselves, Camila Mora, noticed that in his own place in rural Colombia, he had a flood, and he describes in his own first-time recent memory of the water filling his living room. This flood ended up being an ideal breeding ground for mosquitoes, which certainly can worsen things like malaria outbreaks. For himself, he actually contracted chikungunya, which is a nasty virus spread by mosquito bites. And even though he survived, he still feels those joint pains years later. So that's how we see those connections here between climate changes, floodings, and directly into things like animal bites or insect bites causing these human disasters.
All right, Dr. Raut, bringing this back home to our viewers, we know Canada is no stranger to heat waves, and we've experienced multiple heat warnings this summer. So how do extreme heat circumstances impact the overall health of people?
Right, so heat can affect quite a bit. It's surprising. Heat can also affect mental health and community well-being. What we see in occurrences of mood disorders, anxiety disorders, and dementia, and psychological distress, which has been shown to increase when you have increased heat as well. So heat can have such an impact on interpersonal relationships as well. We've seen studies on things like domestic violence and violent crimes that have been shown to spike during these heat waves there.
And did this study by any chance look into how climate disasters affect the impact of COVID-19 on a general population?
Yes, so Mora had originally wanted to look at things such as COVID-19 and see how it would impact disasters. Interestingly, the study found that extreme weather exacerbated and also diminished certain chances of COVID-19. For instance, extreme heat in poor areas had people congregate in order to cool off. And then unfortunately get exposed to COVID-19. But in other situations, heavy downpours actually reduced COVID spread because people stayed at home and indoors away from each other.
All right, Dr. Raut, a quick 45 seconds left here, but what should officials take away from the study here?
I think the key messages here is that climate change affects the social and environmental determinants of health, clean water, safe drinking water, sufficient food, and shelter. So all of these studies are showing that direct impact on infectious and non-infectious disease. So really focusing on greener infrastructure now will in fact result in improved health for Canadians in the future.
Always an informative interview, Dr. Raut. Thank you again for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Stay with us. When we come back from the break, we'll be turning our attention to the investigation into the RCMP's use of spyware in the last 5 years. We're going to be speaking to Dr. Brenda McPhail, the director of the Privacy Technology and Surveillance Program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Stay with us. Privacy experts say that spyware being used by the RCMP is a quantum leap forward from the wiretapping technologies that police have been using for years. This comes as an ethics committee panel continues to look into the RCMP's use of spyware in 32 investigations in the last 5 years. The director of the University of Toronto's Citizen Lab, Ron Dybert, says someone using spyware can access messages and photos, track locations, and even record live audio and video through the device. Experts are urging MPs in the House of Commons Committee to put in place better controls to protect the Canadian public. Well, joining us today to unpack this is Dr. Brenda McPhail, Director of the Privacy Technology and Surveillance Program at the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Dr. McPhail, thank you again for your time today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Now, we know you appeared in front of the committee currently examining the RCMP's use of spyware. So what have you been learning from the hearing so far?
Well, we've heard the RCMP confirm that they have been using what they're calling on-device investigative tools, what most of the rest of the world calls spyware, for a long time. There's actually a bit of interesting fuzziness around that date. One RCMP witness gave a date as far back as 2002, although we know that the current program has been active since 2017.
That's really interesting. Now, what do we know so far about the type of technology currently being used by the RCMP in terms of spyware and what it's capable of?
Well, I think Professor Diebert's characterization of the tool as wiretap on steroids is really accurate. This type of tool allows a covert user to take control of all of the functions of a device that you own. So a cell phone or a computer. It lets them see everything you do in the present. It lets them look back through everything you've done in the past on the device. It can activate the camera. It can activate the microphone. They call that hot mic. It can listen in on calls. It can read texts and emails. It can even go out into cloud storage and see information that's not stored on the device itself. So essentially, it takes advantage of flaws in the operating system of your devices to hack into the flow of information that we all create minute by minute as we interact with our devices.
Some serious privacy concerns around that, Doctor. Now, we know your organization is calling for an immediate moratorium on spyware used to collect personal information remotely. So tell us a little bit about this push and what's at risk here in terms of public safety.
Well, really fundamentally, what's at risk is public trust in the RCMP. This is a big deal, the fact that this controversial technology has been used secretly for a long time. And it's important to note that this is the third reveal of this nature where we found out from the press that police are using surveillance tools that are controversial without debate and without appropriate accountability or public transparency. So in terms of public safety, the argument, of course, is these tools are helping police do investigations that they couldn't do without their use. But in terms of people feeling safe and assured that their law enforcement bodies are taking their rights seriously, what we're really missing is public accountability and a thorough public explanation of why these tools are needed, whether every other option has been exhausted before they're put into place, and the genuine analysis about whether or not the benefits to public safety are proportionate to the risks more broadly.
And if the RCMP were to have access to such technology, you say there needs to be a system that needs to be put in place in terms of accountability and transparency. So what would this sort of system look like?
We need to get rid of this culture of secrecy that seems to surround our law enforcement bodies. It's reasonable to protect investigations and the tools that are needed to do investigations carefully and well. It's not reasonable to hide the use of categories of technologies that require public debate to ensure that they're in keeping with Canadian values. So we need better privacy laws that mandate privacy impact assessments for police when they're going to use an invasive new technology. That would mean they'd have to show justification to the Privacy Commissioner of Canada, who's well equipped to confidentially review that information and assess whether or not police are taking the right steps to protect people's privacy when using the tools. We need to get rid of or narrow law enforcement exemptions in our Access to Information Act that prevent us from finding out about these tools. We need to take a look at the part of the criminal code that tells police what they have to do to get a warrant in order to use these tools, to make sure that it's up to date and modern and fit for purpose, given the nature of these new technologies. And we need to think about doing, as our allies in the US have done, creating an entity list of banned spyware vendors.
Ukraine's Air Force says 9 Russian warplanes have been destroyed in explosions at an airbase in Crimea. However, Russia denies any aircraft were damaged or that an attack even took place. It says instead that munitions at the Saki Air Base caught fire and blew up. Ukrainian officials have stopped short of publicly claiming responsibility, but hours after the blasts, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky vowed in his nightly address to retake the peninsula. Meanwhile, China has reaffirmed its threat to use military force to bring self-governing Taiwan under its control. Beijing says it seeks what it calls peaceful unification with Taiwan, but it, quote, does not pledge to relinquish the use of military force and retains all necessary options. The statement follows almost a week of threatening Chinese military exercises near the island, which have disrupted flights and shipping. China says the action was prompted by last week's visit to Taiwan by U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. In the U.S., Americans had a slight break from the pain of inflation in July with the help of falling gas prices. U.S. consumer prices rose 8.5% last month compared with a year earlier. Now that's down from a 9.1% year-over-year jump in June. Still, prices are spiking across a wide range of goods and services, leaving most Americans worse off. All right, moving to South Korea, where cleanup and recovery efforts are underway after 2 days of record-breaking rainfall that led to flash floods. At least 9 people were killed and 7 remain missing in Seoul and a nearby province. Thousands of buildings and roads were damaged. South Korea's weather agency has lifted heavy rain warnings for Seoul and the neighboring metropolitan areas, but it is forecasting up to 30 centimeters of rain in the country's southern regions through tomorrow. All of this comes as Germany continues to deal with extremely dry weather that could pose a risk to the transport of goods along a key river. Officials say water levels on the Rhine could reach a critically low point in the coming days. This would make transporting goods along the river, such as coal and gas, increasingly difficult. Weeks of dry weather have turned several of Europe's major waterways into trickles. Moving to France now, where more than 1,000 firefighters are battling a wildfire in a southwestern region known for its pine forests. About 6,000 people in Gironde have been forced to evacuate, and at least 16 homes have been destroyed. The region was already hit by a major wildfire last month. France is in the midst of its 4th heat wave of the year. Temperatures in the south are expected to reach up to 40 degrees Celsius. All right, back in the U.S., Donald Trump has invoked the Fifth Amendment and did not answer questions regarding an investigation into his business dealings. The New York Attorney General's civil investigation is looking into allegations that Mr. Trump's company misstated the value of prized assets like golf courses and skyscrapers. Mr. Trump says his family and company have been targeted by what he describes as a politically motivated witch hunt. The former U.S. president says he had no choice but to take the fifth as he maintained his innocence. Tensions rise in Burkina Faso, where the army says at least 15 soldiers were killed in the country's north when their vehicles hit landmines. This includes a rescue team that hit a second explosive device when they were rushing to help. The army said that no group has taken responsibility yet for the attack, and investigations are underway. Burkina Faso is grappling with soaring jihadi violence linked to al-Qaeda and the Islamic State group. It has killed thousands and displaced nearly 2 million people. History was made today in the U.S. after President Joe Biden signed veterans' health care legislation this morning. Now, this ends a long battle to expand benefits for people who served near burn pits. And it's a personal issue for Mr. Biden. His eldest son, Beau, was a major in the Delaware Army National Guard, and he died of brain cancer after his service in Iraq. Burn pits were used in Iraq and Afghanistan to dispose of chemicals, tires, plastics, medical equipment, and human waste. The legislation will help veterans get disability payments without having to prove their illness was the result of their service. Other healthcare services will also be expanded. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow us on our social media handles on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also watch all of our commentary, programming, and interviews on the News Forum YouTube channel. All right, thanks for joining us today on Forum Daily News, and we'll see you again next time. Take care, Canada.